When the rescue team at Second Chance Shelter received a desperate call about a German Shepherd chained and left to die at an abandoned Montana farm, they dropped everything and drove through the blizzard. But nothing could have prepared them for what they found. Because this wasn't just any dog, this was Ranger, the same dog they'd rescued 6 months ago and placed with what they thought was a loving home. How could this happen? How could they have been so wrong? What Sarah Mitchell saw when she found him hiding in that frozen barn would haunt her forever. The barn door creaked open. Icy wind swept inside, carrying snowflakes and the sickening smell of decay, rust, and fear. "Ranger?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Ranger, baby, are you here?" Silence. Then, a sound so faint she almost missed it. A whimper. Broken. Hopeless. Sarah's flashlight cut through darkness, sweeping across rusted equipment and rotting hay, and then she saw him. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. In the corner behind a skeletal metal cage, a shadow trembled. Ranger. But this wasn't the Ranger she remembered. This wasn't the intelligent, dignified German Shepherd she'd proudly handed over to Mark Collins, a former K-9 officer, believing she'd found him the perfect home. This was a ghost, a living, breathing ghost. His once glossy black and tan coat hung in matted clumps, revealing patches of raw, infected skin beneath. His ribs jutted out like prison bars. A thick metal chain, far too heavy for any dog, was wound tightly around his neck, the rusted links digging into flesh that had long since given up trying to heal. But it was his eyes that destroyed her. Those deep brown eyes, once so full of intelligence and cautious hope, were now empty. Dead. The eyes of a creature who had stopped believing in tomorrow. Sarah dropped to her knees, snow and ice soaking through her jeans. "Ranger, baby, it's me. It's Sarah. I'm here. I'm so sorry." "I'm so sorry." The dog didn't move, didn't even blink. He just stared past her as if looking at something, or someone, far more terrifying than she could ever imagine. And in that moment, Sarah Mitchell understood the full weight of her failure. She had saved him once, and then she'd handed him to hell. Her radio crackled. "Sarah, what's your status? Did you find the dog?" She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. All she could do was stare at what Mark Collins had done. Finally, she pressed the button. "I found him. Get Dr. Morrison. Now, tell him we have maybe 24 hours. Tell him—" Her voice broke. "Tell him I'm sorry." She inched closer, moving slowly, carefully. Ranger's entire body trembled, muscles coiled tight as if preparing to bolt. His ears pinned flat against his skull and his eyes darted wildly, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. A low, broken whimper escaped his throat, the sound of a soul that had given up on hope. "I'm not going to hurt you," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. "Never again. I promise you, never again." She reached out, and Ranger flinched so violently he slammed his head against the metal bars. Blood trickled from a fresh wound above his eye, mixing with the crusted blood already matted in his fur. Sarah's hand froze midair. Behind her, footsteps crunched through snow. Her assistant Jake appeared in the doorway. He took one look at Ranger and went pale. "Oh, God! Sarah, what did that monster do to him?" Sarah's jaw clenched. "Get the bolt cutters. We're getting him out of here. And Jake." She turned, her eyes blazing with a fury she'd never felt before. "Call the police. Mark Collins is going to answer for this." The bolt cutters felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds in Sarah's hands. She approached Ranger slowly, each step deliberate, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The dog watched her with those dead eyes, his body pressed so tightly against the back of the cage that she wondered if he was trying to disappear into the metal itself. "Easy, boy, easy." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm going to get this chain off you. It's going to be okay." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Nothing about this was okay. Nothing about this would ever be okay again. The chain was wrapped around his neck 3 times, each loop tighter than the last. Rust and dried blood fused the links together. Sarah positioned the bolt cutters, her hands shaking, not from the cold but from rage, from guilt, from the devastating realization that she had done this. She had looked at Mark Collins's credentials, his experience as a canine handler, his clean record, and she had thought, perfect. She had been so wrong. The first link snapped with a metallic crack that echoed through the barn. Ranger yelped, a sound so full of terror that Sarah's heart shattered into pieces. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," she chanted, working faster now, cutting through link after link. When the last one broke free, the chain fell away, hitting the frozen ground with a heavy thud. Ranger's neck was a nightmare. 3 deep grooves carved into his flesh, infected and oozing. The skin had tried to heal around the chain, creating raised, angry welts that would scar him forever. Sarah's vision blurred with tears. She pulled off her coat and wrapped it around Ranger's trembling body. "Jake, we need to move him, now." Together they lifted Ranger from the cage. He was so light, impossibly light for a German shepherd of his size. Sarah could feel every bone, every ridge of his spine through her coat. He didn't fight them. He didn't struggle. He just hung there in their arms, limp, defeated, as if he'd finally accepted that this was how his story would end. They carried him through the blizzard to the rescue van. Sarah climbed into the back with him, cradling his head in her lap. Jake started the engine, and they began the 40-minute drive to Dr. Morrison's clinic. Sarah pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and dialed. "Morrison," the doctor's voice was gruff, still heavy with sleep. "James, it's Sarah. I need you at the clinic, now." "Sarah, it's 2 in the morning. James." Her voice cracked. "It's bad. It's really bad. We have maybe hours, not days." A pause, then, "I'm on my way." Sarah looked down at Ranger. His breathing was shallow, labored. Each inhale seemed to take more effort than the last. She stroked his head gently, carefully avoiding the fresh wound and the dozens of old ones hidden beneath matted fur. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please, stay with me. I know I don't deserve it. I know I failed you. But please, just hold on a little longer." The van hit a pothole, and Ranger whimpered. Sarah adjusted her position, trying to cushion him from the rough road. Outside, the blizzard raged harder, wind howling like a living thing. She thought about Mark Collins, about how she'd sat across from him in her office 6 months ago, reviewing his application. "I understand dogs," he'd said, his voice steady, confident. "I worked with Rex for 8 years. He was my partner, my best friend. When he died, something in me died too. I'm ready to try again, ready to give another dog the home Rex had." She'd been moved by his story, moved by the pain in his eyes when he spoke about losing Rex. She'd thought, this man knows loss. He'll never take Ranger for granted. But she'd been wrong. So terribly, devastatingly wrong. "Sarah." Jake's voice pulled her back to the present. "We're here." Dr. Morrison's clinic was ablaze with light. The 62-year-old veterinarian stood in the doorway, still pulling on his coat. His weathered face showed no emotion as Sarah and Jake carried Ranger inside, but his hands moved with practiced efficiency, directing them to the examination table. "Set him down." Gently, they lowered Ranger onto the cold metal surface. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the full extent of his injuries became horrifyingly clear. Dr. Morrison's jaw tightened as he began his examination, his fingers moving carefully over Ranger's body. Sarah watched his face, waiting for some sign, some indication of hope. There was none. "Jesus Christ," Dr. Morrison muttered. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes hard. "How long was he like this?" "I don't know. 6 months, maybe. That's when I placed him with—" "6 months, Doctor?" Morrison's voice rose. "Sarah, this dog has been systematically tortured. These wounds, this level of neglect, this isn't 6 months. This is sustained, deliberate cruelty." Sarah felt the room spin. She gripped the edge of the examination table to steady herself. "Can you save him?" Dr. Morrison didn't answer immediately. He continued his examination, his expression growing darker with each discovery. Ranger lay completely still, his eyes open but unseeing, as if his spirit had already left his body, even though his heart still beat. "The neck wounds are severely infected," Dr. Morrison finally said, his voice clinical, detached, the only way he could deliver such devastating news. "The infection has spread. He's septic. His body temperature is dangerously low. He's malnourished to the point of organ failure. And these—" he gestured to scars crisscrossing Ranger's body. "Burns, recent ones. My guess, electrical." Sarah's legs gave out. She stumbled backward, caught herself against the wall. "No! No, no, no!" "There's more." Dr. Morrison's voice was gentle now, almost apologetic. "His vocal cords are damaged, likely from excessive barking, screaming. The tissue is scarred. He may never bark again." "But can you save him?" Sarah's voice was desperate, pleading. "Please, James, can you save him?" Dr. Morrison looked at Ranger, then back at Sarah. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "I can try. But Sarah, even if his body survives, I don't know if he'll ever recover from this, the psychological damage. I don't care. We have to try. The surgery alone will cost thousands, and the aftercare. I don't care about the money." Sarah's voice echoed through the clinic. "This is my fault. I put him in that hell. I have to fix this. I have to." Dr. Morrison studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right. But I need to operate now. The infection is spreading fast." "Another few hours and we'll lose him. Do it. Do whatever it takes." As Dr. Morrison began prepping for surgery, calling in his assistant, gathering instruments, Sarah pulled out her phone again. Her fingers hovered over Mark Collins's number. She wanted to call him, wanted to scream at him, demand answers, make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd inflicted on this innocent animal. But instead, she dialed the police. "Sheriff's Department. This is Sarah Mitchell from Second Chance Shelter. I need to report a case of severe animal abuse. The perpetrator is Mark Collins, 147 Pine Ridge Road." Her voice was steady now, cold with fury. "I'm at Morrison Animal Hospital with the victim. You need to send someone, now. Ma'am, we'll dispatch an officer, but in this blizzard, I don't care if you have to walk here. This man tortured an animal for 6 months. He needs to be arrested. Tonight." She hung up. Through the window of the operating room, she could see Dr. Morrison working on Ranger, his hands steady despite the late hour, despite the odds. Sarah pressed her palm against the glass. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, but I'm not giving up on you. Not this time. Not ever again." Behind her, Jake cleared his throat. "Sarah, there's something you should know. When we were loading Ranger, I found this." He held up a piece of paper, wrinkled and stained. It was nailed to the barn door. Sarah took it with trembling hands. 5 words written in Mark's handwriting. He was never good enough. The paper slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor like a death sentence. And for the first time since finding Ranger, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to break down completely, her sobs echoing through the empty clinic as snow continued to fall outside, burying the world in white. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Sarah never left her post by the window, watching Dr. Morrison work with the precision of a man who'd spent 25 years saving lives that others had given up on. Through the glass, she could see Ranger's chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity, kept alive by machines and Morrison's stubborn refusal to let death win. When the operating room door finally opened, Dr. Morrison emerged, pulling off bloodied gloves. His face was drawn, exhausted, but there was something in his eyes, not quite hope, but not defeat either. "He's alive," Morrison said simply. Sarah's knees buckled. Jake caught her before she hit the ground. Will he? "The next 24 hours are critical. The infection was worse than I thought. It had reached the bloodstream. I've cleaned the wounds, inserted drainage tubes, started him on aggressive antibiotics." Morrison paused, running a hand through his gray hair. "But Sarah, his body has been through hell. Even if he survives this, the road ahead is long, very long." "Can I see him?" Morrison nodded, leading her into the recovery room. Ranger lay on a heated pad, his neck wrapped in pristine white bandages that were already seeping through with blood and fluid. An IV line ran into his leg. His breathing was steady but shallow. He looked so small, so fragile, so utterly broken. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat beside him. She didn't touch him, didn't want to cause more pain, but she leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm here. I'm not leaving. I promise you, I'm not leaving." Ranger's eyes remained closed. The only sign he was alive was the slight rise and fall of his chest. Behind her, the clinic door burst open. Sheriff Tom Blackwood stood there, snow dusting his uniform, his weathered face grim. "Sarah Mitchell?" She stood slowly, reluctantly, leaving Ranger's side. "Sheriff, I need you to come with me. We're going to Mark Collins' house. I need you to identify any equipment, any evidence of what happened to that dog." Sarah looked back at Ranger, then at Morrison. The doctor nodded. "Go. I'll watch him. I'll call you if anything changes." The drive to Mark Collins's house took 30 minutes through the dying blizzard. Sarah sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out at the white landscape, feeling nothing. She'd cried herself empty. Now there was only a cold, hard determination. Mark's house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, a modest ranch-style home that looked utterly normal. That was what made it worse, the ordinary facade hiding the horror within. Sheriff Blackwood knocked on the door. Once, twice, no answer. "Mark Collins, this is Sheriff Blackwood. Open the door." Silence. Blackwood tried the handle. Unlocked. He pushed the door open, hand on his weapon. "Sheriff's Department, we're coming in." The house was dark, cold. Sarah followed the sheriff inside, her heart pounding. The living room looked normal. A worn couch, a television, photos on the mantel. She stepped closer to the photos. Mark in uniform. Mark with a German shepherd. Rex, presumably. The dog looked noble, proud, alive in a way Ranger never had been. "In here." Blackwood's voice came from down the hall. Sarah followed the sound to what must have been Mark's home office. Her blood ran cold. The walls were covered with charts, diagrams, training protocols. But these weren't normal training methods. These were punishment techniques, escalation strategies, dominance theories that had been debunked decades ago. And there on the desk, a journal lay open. Sarah picked it up with shaking hands and began to read. Day 1. Ranger arrived today. He's nothing like Rex. Soft, submissive, Weak. This needs to change. Day 15. Increased shock, collar intensity. He still flinches instead of fights. Rex never flinched. Day 43. Reduced food portions. A hungry dog is a motivated dog. Rex understood this. Day 89. He tried to run today. Coward. Rex would never run. Added chain to remind him he has nowhere to go. Day 156. I see Rex in my dreams. He asks why I let him die, why I wasn't fast enough. Maybe if Ranger was stronger, like Rex, I could forgive myself. Day 178. It's not working. Nothing works. He'll never be Rex. He'll never be anything. The entries continued, each one more disturbing than the last. Sarah's hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the journal. This wasn't just abuse. This was a man trying to resurrect his dead partner by destroying a living dog. This was grief twisted into something monstrous. Sarah. Sheriff Blackwood stood in the doorway of another room. His face had gone pale. You need to see this. She followed him to what appeared to be a basement door. He flicked on a light, and they descended wooden stairs into a concrete room that reeked of urine, feces, and despair. In the corner sat a metal cage, identical to the one they'd found Ranger in. But this one had scratch marks on the inside, deep gouges where a dog had frantically tried to escape. On a workbench, instruments of torture were laid out with grotesque precision, shock collars set to maximum voltage, metal chains of varying weights, a wooden stick stained dark with old blood. And in the corner, a mannequin dressed in tactical gear, the kind K-9 officers wore. He was training him, Sarah whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. He was trying to recreate Rex, but Ranger isn't an attack dog. He's gentle, sensitive, so Mark punished him for not being something he could never be. Blackwood was already on his radio. This is Sheriff Blackwood. I need all units. We're looking for Mark Collins, white male, 40 years old. Consider him dangerous. Possible mental health crisis. As they climbed back up the stairs, Sarah's phone rang. Morrison's name flashed on the screen. Her heart stopped. Hello? Sarah, you need to come back. Now. Is he? He's awake. But Sarah. Morrison's voice cracked. He won't eat, won't drink. He just lies there, staring at nothing. It's like he's given up, like he's waiting to die. Sarah was already running for the door. I'm coming. Tell him I'm coming. The drive back to the clinic felt endless. Sarah's mind raced with images of Ranger, alone, afraid, believing he'd been abandoned again. When they finally pulled up, she didn't wait for the car to fully stop. She threw open the door and ran inside. Morrison stood in the hallway outside the recovery room. Sarah, before you go in, you need to understand, sometimes when animals have been through what Ranger's been through, they lose the will to live. Their bodies can heal, but their spirits... No. Sarah pushed past him. No, he's not giving up. I won't let him. She entered the recovery room and her heart broke all over again. Ranger lay exactly as she'd left him, but his eyes were open now. Those beautiful brown eyes that had once held such intelligence and hope, now they held nothing. They stared at the wall, empty, dead. Ranger. Sarah approached slowly, carefully. She knelt beside the heated pad. Ranger, baby, it's me. It's Sarah. I'm here. I'm right here. No response, not even a flicker of recognition. I know you're scared. I know you've been hurt so badly. I know you think this is just going to happen again, but I promise you, I swear to you, it won't. Never again. Still nothing. Sarah's voice broke. Please, please don't give up. I know I don't deserve your trust. I know I failed you. But please, just give me one more chance. Let me fix this. Let me show you that not all humans are monsters." Ranger's eyes slowly, so slowly, shifted toward her. For a moment their gazes met, and in that moment Sarah saw it, the question, the doubt, the fear, and beneath it all the tiniest, most fragile spark of something that might someday become hope again. But then Ranger closed his eyes, shutting her out, shutting out the world. Sarah stood there, helpless, as a single tear rolled down her cheek and landed on Ranger's paw. And for the first time in her 15 years of rescue work, Sarah Mitchell truly understood the weight of a promise broken. She had promised Ranger safety, love, a home, and she had delivered him to hell instead. The night stretched on. Sarah refused to leave. She pulled the chair close and simply sat there, watching Ranger breathe, counting each breath like a prayer. Morrison brought her coffee she didn't drink. Jake brought her food she didn't eat. Outside, the blizzard finally stopped, leaving the world silent and white. At 4 a.m., Ranger's eyes opened again. This time they found Sarah immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah held her breath, not daring to move, not daring to hope. Then Ranger did something that made Sarah's heart stop. He lifted his head, just an inch, just for a second, and looked toward the water bowl Morrison had left nearby. It was the first sign of will, the first sign of want, the first sign that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't ready to die after all. "You're thirsty," Sarah whispered. Okay, let's get you some water." She stood carefully, retrieved the bowl, and knelt beside him. With trembling hands, she lifted Ranger's head gently, supporting his neck away from the wounds, and brought the bowl to his lips. For a moment he did nothing. Then his tongue moved, lapping weakly at the water. Once, twice, 3 times. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Sarah set down the bowl and allowed herself to breathe. "That's it. That's my boy. Just keep fighting. Just keep fighting and I'll do the rest." 3 days passed in a blur of hope and despair. Ranger survived the critical first 24 hours, then 48, then 72. Each day was a battle, each breath a victory. But while his body slowly responded to treatment, his spirit remained locked away somewhere Sarah couldn't reach. Dr. Morrison changed bandages twice daily, the wounds showing signs of healing but still angry and raw. Ranger never flinched during these procedures, never whimpered, never reacted at all. It was as if he'd retreated so deep inside himself that physical pain couldn't touch him anymore. "It's not unusual," Morrison explained on the 4th morning, checking Ranger's vitals. "Severe trauma can cause this kind of shutdown. His mind is protecting itself the only way it knows how, by feeling nothing at all." Sarah nodded, though she barely heard him. She'd been at the clinic for 4 days straight, surviving on coffee and guilt. Jake had brought her clean clothes. The shelter had somehow continued operating without her, volunteers stepping up, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave Ranger's side. Not when he was so fragile, not when he needed her most. On the 5th day, Sheriff Blackwood appeared at the clinic door, his expression grim. "We found Mark Collins." Sarah stood quickly, her heart pounding. "Where?" "His truck was spotted at a motel outside Billings. He didn't resist arrest." Blackwood paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "Sarah, when we brought him in, he asked about the dog, asked if Ranger was alive. He has no right, I know, but there's something you need to understand. Mark Collins isn't just an abuser. He's a broken man. His psychiatric evaluation came back. Severe PTSD, survivor's guilt. Untreated depression since his canine partner died 3 years ago. Blackwood held up a hand as Sarah started to protest. I'm not making excuses. What he did is unforgivable. But the prosecutor wants to know if you'll testify. They're pushing for maximum charges, aggravated animal cruelty, torture. He could get 5 years. 5 years? Sarah's voice was sharp. He tortured Ranger for 6 months. 5 years isn't enough. It's the maximum Montana law allows for animal cruelty. Unless, Blackwood hesitated, unless we can prove he did this to other animals. The evidence in his house suggests Ranger wasn't the first. There are records, notes about other dogs from his canine training days. If we can find those dogs, prove a pattern. Do it, whatever it takes. After Blackwood left, Sarah returned to Ranger's side. She pulled her chair close, as she had every day, and began talking to him. She told him about the shelter, about the other dogs waiting for homes, about the volunteers who asked about him every day. She told him stories about successful adoptions, about dogs who'd been broken and found love again. Ranger never responded. But his eyes would occasionally shift toward her voice, and Sarah clung to that small acknowledgement like a lifeline. On the 6th day, everything changed. Sarah had dozed off in her chair, exhausted from sleepless nights, when a sound jolted her awake. At first, she thought she'd imagined it, but then it came again. A soft, broken whimper. She looked at Ranger. His eyes were open, staring at something across the room. Following his gaze, Sarah's blood ran cold. Through the window, a man stood in the parking lot. Even from a distance, even in the dim morning light, she recognized him. Mark Collins. He must have made bail. Ranger's entire body had gone rigid. His breathing quickened, shallow and panicked. The heart monitor began beeping faster, faster, faster. Every muscle trembled with a fear so primal it was painful to witness. No, no, no. Sarah moved between Ranger and the window, blocking his view. He can't hurt you. He can't get to you. I promise. But Ranger wasn't listening. He was lost in his terror, reliving every moment of torture, every betrayal. His wounds began seeping fresh blood as his body tensed. The heart monitor screamed. Morrison burst through the door. What's happening? He's here. Mark Collins is here. Morrison's face darkened. He moved to the window and pulled the blinds shut, then grabbed his phone. I'm calling the police. There's a restraining order. He's not supposed to be within 500 feet. But the damage was done. Ranger's panic attack continued, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with remembered pain. Sarah knelt beside him, desperate. Ranger, please. Please look at me. He's not here. He can't get to you. I won't let him. She did something then that she hadn't dared to do before. She reached out slowly, carefully, and placed her hand on the one part of Ranger that wasn't injured, his paw. He flinched at the contact, every instinct screaming at him to pull away. But Sarah didn't move her hand. She kept it there, steady and warm, a gentle pressure that said, You're not alone. I'm here, she whispered. I'm right here. And I'm not leaving. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. For the longest moment, nothing happened. Then so gradually, she almost missed it. Ranger's breathing began to slow. The heart monitor's frantic beeping eased. His eyes, still wide with fear, shifted from the covered window to Sarah's face, and he didn't pull his paw away. It was the smallest of gestures, but it meant everything. It meant that somewhere, buried beneath layers of trauma and terror, a tiny seed of trust might still exist. Sarah stayed like that, her hand on his paw, until the police arrived and escorted Mark Collins away. Even then she didn't move. She maintained that connection, that bridge between his broken world and the possibility of something better. Morrison returned after speaking with the officers. He's been arrested. Violation of the restraining order. He won't make bail this time. Sarah nodded but didn't look away from Ranger. James, I need to ask you something. Anything. What are his chances? Really? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then, physically, with time, he'll heal. The wounds will scar, but they'll close. The infection is responding to antibiotics. His body is young enough, strong enough to recover. He paused. But mentally, emotionally, Sarah, I've been a vet for 25 years. I've seen animals come back from terrible things. But I've also seen animals who survive but never really live again. They exist, they breathe, but that spark, that essence of who they were, sometimes it's just gone. And Ranger? I don't know. He's responding to you, which is something, but he has a long road ahead. Months, maybe years of rehabilitation. And even then, he may never be the dog he was supposed to be. He may never fully trust again. He may always carry this fear. Sarah looked down at Ranger, at his beautiful, damaged face. Then I'll carry it with him, for as long as it takes. That afternoon, a woman appeared at the clinic. She was elderly, perhaps 75, with silver hair and kind eyes. She wore a worn wool coat and carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd weathered many storms. "Excuse me," she said to Morrison at the front desk. "I heard about the German Shepherd, the one who was hurt. I'd like to see him, if that's possible." Morrison frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but he's not receiving visitors. My name is Margaret Walsh. Maggie." The woman's voice was gentle but firm. "And I think I knew this dog, a long time ago." Something in her tone made Morrison pause. "Wait here." He found Sarah in the recovery room and explained. Sarah was reluctant. Ranger had only just begun to stabilize. But something about the name Walsh nagged at her. Where had she heard it before? 5 minutes, Sarah agreed. But if he shows any distress, she leaves immediately. Maggie Walsh entered the room slowly, leaning on a cane. When her eyes fell on Ranger, she stopped. Her hand went to her mouth, and tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. "Oh, God," she whispered. "It is him. It's really him." "You know Ranger?" Sarah asked, confused. "Ranger." Maggie said the name like a prayer. "Is that what they named him?" She moved closer, and Sarah noticed Ranger's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. He wasn't panicking, wasn't afraid. He was watching the old woman with something that looked almost like recognition. "Ma'am, I don't understand. How do you know him?" Maggie reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out a photograph, faded and creased from age. She handed it to Sarah. The photo showed a younger Maggie standing beside a man in military uniform. At their feet sat a German Shepherd puppy with intelligent eyes and a distinctive marking on his chest, a white patch shaped like a star. Sarah looked from the photo to Ranger. There, beneath the matted fur and scars, was the same white patch. "That's my late husband, George," Maggie said, her voice breaking. "He was a canine trainer. That puppy was one of his trainees 8 years ago. George said he was too gentle, too soft for police work. He rejected him from the program." She wiped her eyes. "George died 6 years ago, took his own life, PTSD from Vietnam. He was never the same after the war." Sarah's mind reeled. "Your husband trained Ranger?" "If that's his name now, yes. George called him Scout back then. Said he had the heart of a shepherd, but not the teeth of a warrior." Maggie knelt beside Ranger, her movements slow and painful. "After George died, I tried to find out what happened to the dogs he'd trained. Most had been adopted out. But this one, Scout, I could never find any records." She reached out, her aged hand hovering over Ranger's head. "May I?" Sarah wanted to say no, wanted to protect Ranger from any more stress, but something stopped her. Ranger was still watching Maggie, and in his eyes was something Sarah hadn't seen before. A flicker of memory, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. Slowly, Sarah cautioned. Maggie's hand descended gently, coming to rest on Ranger's head. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, impossibly, his eyes closed. Not in fear, but in something that looked almost like relief. "I'm sorry," Maggie whispered to him. "I'm so sorry for what my George started, for what others finished. You deserved better. You deserved so much better." And then something miraculous happened. From deep in Ranger's chest came a sound, not a whimper of pain or a growl of warning, but a sigh. A deep, exhausted sigh, as if he'd been holding his breath for 8 years and finally felt safe enough to let it go. Sarah watched, stunned, as Ranger, this dog who hadn't responded to anyone, who'd locked himself away from the world, leaned into Maggie's touch. Just slightly. Just enough. Maggie looked up at Sarah, tears streaming down her face. "I'd like to help, if I can. With his care, his recovery. I don't have much, just my Social Security and an empty house. But I have time, and I owe him this. I owe him everything." Sarah stared at Maggie Walsh, trying to process what she'd just witnessed. In all the days she'd spent by Ranger's side, she'd never seen him respond to touch without fear, never seen him lean into comfort. Yet here was this elderly woman, a stranger to Sarah, but apparently not to Ranger, and he'd recognized something in her, something safe. "Mrs. Walsh," Sarah began carefully, "I appreciate your offer, but Ranger's care is complex. He needs constant monitoring, medication every few hours, wound care." "I was a nurse for 40 years, Maggie interrupted gently. "Before George and I married, I worked at St. Mary's Hospital in Billings. I know how to care for the wounded." She looked back at Ranger, her hand still resting on his head. "And I know how to care for the broken. I lived with George's demons for 35 years. I understand what trauma does to a soul." Morrison, who'd been standing quietly in the doorway, cleared his throat. "Sarah, might I speak with you outside?" In the hallway, Morrison kept his voice low. "I know what you're thinking, but we need to consider Ranger's response. He's shown more recognition with her in 5 minutes than he has with us in 6 days. She's 75 years old, James, living on Social Security. How can she possibly manage?" "The same way she managed to care for a husband with severe PTSD for 3 decades. Morrison's eyes were kind but firm. "Sarah, I know you feel responsible for Ranger, but maybe what he needs isn't someone consumed with guilt. Maybe he needs someone who understands that healing isn't about fixing. It's about patience." Sarah wanted to argue, but the words died in her throat. She looked through the window into the recovery room. Maggie had pulled up Sarah's chair and was sitting beside Ranger, talking to him in a low, soothing voice, and Ranger, impossibly, was listening. His eyes were open, focused on her face. "Tell me about her husband," Sarah said quietly. "About George Walsh." Morrison hesitated. "George was a good man who came back from war broken. He tried to do right, became a canine trainer, thought he could use his military experience for something positive. But his methods—" Morrison paused. "They came from a place of pain. He believed the only way to keep dogs safe was to make them hard, aggressive, fearless. He couldn't see that some dogs, like some people, aren't built for war. And Ranger was one of those dogs. Scout, they called him then. George rejected him from the program, marked him as unsuitable for service. Last I heard, he'd been adopted out to a family in Helena. But that was 8 years ago." Sarah's mind raced, piecing together Ranger's history. Rejected by George for being too gentle. Adopted, then somehow ending up back in the system. Eventually placed with Mark Collins, another broken veteran trying to recreate what he'd lost. Ranger had been passed from one damaged man to another, each one punishing him for not being the warrior they needed him to be. "She can't adopt him," Sarah finally said. "The legal proceedings against Mark aren't finished. Ranger is technically still evidence." "Then supervised visitation," Morrison suggested. "Let her come during recovery. Let's see if this connection continues." Sarah nodded slowly, then returned to the room. Maggie looked up, hope and apprehension warring on her weathered face. "You can visit," Sarah said, "every day, if you'd like. But, Mrs. Walsh, I need you to understand. Ranger may never be the dog you remember. The trauma he's endured." "I don't expect him to be Scout," Maggie said softly. "That puppy is gone. Just like the man I married is gone. But maybe," her voice caught, "maybe we can help each other learn to live with what we've become." Over the next week, Maggie came every day. She'd arrive at 9 in the morning, carrying a thermos of soup and a worn book of poetry. She'd sit beside Ranger, reading aloud in her gentle voice. Sometimes she'd tell him stories about George, not the broken man who'd rejected him, but the young soldier who'd loved dogs, who'd dreamed of a world where violence wasn't necessary. "George wrote me letters from Vietnam," she told Ranger one afternoon, Sarah listening from the corner. "He said the war dogs saved more lives than anyone knew. But he said it wasn't right, what they asked of those animals. Wasn't right to take something pure and teach it to hurt." Maggie's fingers stroked Ranger's head carefully, avoiding his wounds. He never forgave himself for the dogs he trained, for taking their gentleness and calling it weakness. Ranger listened, his breathing steady. He still didn't eat much, still didn't respond to Morrison's commands or Sarah's coaxing. But when Maggie was there, some of the tension left his body. It was as if her presence gave him permission to rest. On the 9th day, Dr. Morrison delivered news that changed everything. "The drainage tubes can come out. The infection is clearing. If he continues to improve, he can be discharged in a week." Sarah's relief was immediate, but it came with a crushing question. Discharged to where? The shelter was full, and Ranger needed more care than they could provide. He needed a quiet home, constant attention, someone who understood trauma. She looked at Maggie, who was reading to Ranger from a book of Mary Oliver poems. The old woman's voice was soft but steady. "You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting." "Mrs. Walsh," Sarah interrupted gently. "Could we speak outside?" In the hallway, Sarah took a deep breath. "Ranger will need a foster home, somewhere quiet, with someone experienced in trauma care." "I know you've mentioned your house." "Yes." Maggie's response was immediate, certain. "Yes, I'll take him. It's not adoption, not yet. The legal case against Mark could take months, and there would be conditions. Daily updates, weekly vet visits, home inspections." "I understand." "Mrs. Walsh, Maggie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." Sarah met the older woman's eyes. "Can you afford this? The medications alone cost hundreds of dollars a month. The follow-up care, the special food he'll need." Maggie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was small. "I have $300 in savings. My house is paid off, but the heating system is failing. I've been eating 1 meal a day to make the Social Security stretch." She looked through the window at Ranger. "But I'll figure it out. I always do." Sarah's heart broke. Here was this woman, struggling to survive herself, offering to take on a dog with extensive needs. It was noble and foolish and completely impossible. "We'll help," Sarah found herself saying. "The shelter has an emergency medical fund. We'll cover his medications, his vet visits, and I'll bring food every week. We'll make this work." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. Why? Why would you do this? Because Ranger responded to you when he wouldn't respond to anyone else. Because you understand what he needs in a way I never could. Sarah's voice broke. Because I failed him once. I won't fail him again by letting pride stand in the way of his healing. That afternoon, Sarah made calls. She contacted 3 board members of Second Chance Shelter, explained the situation, and asked for approval to cover Ranger's medical expenses. The vote was unanimous. Then she called local businesses, asking for donations of dog food, supplies, anything that might help. By evening, she'd secured enough resources to support Ranger's care for 6 months. It wasn't perfect, and it would require careful budgeting, but it was possible. When she told Maggie, the old woman wept openly. I don't know how to thank you. Take care of him. That's all the thanks I need. On the 10th day, Sheriff Blackwood returned with an update on Mark Collins. The psych evaluation confirmed severe PTSD and major depressive disorder. His lawyer is pushing for mental health treatment instead of prison time. Sarah's jaw clenched. He tortured an animal for 6 months. I know. The prosecutor is fighting it, but Sarah, Blackwood pulled out a folder. We found something. In Mark's house, there was a letter, written to Ranger but never sent. He handed her a single page, covered in Mark's handwriting. Sarah read, her hands trembling. I see Rex in my dreams. He's asking me why I let him die. Why I wasn't fast enough, wasn't strong enough to save him. I thought if I could make you like him, brave and fearless, I could prove I wasn't weak. But you're not Rex. You were never supposed to be Rex. And I hate you for it. I hate you because every time I look at you, I see my failure. I see the moment Rex took that bullet meant for me. I see the light leave his eyes. And I can't live with that. So I hurt you because hurting you is easier than facing what I've become. I'm sorry, God help me, I'm sorry. But sorry doesn't fix anything. Sorry doesn't bring Rex back. And sorry won't undo what I've done to you. Sarah's hand shook so violently, she nearly dropped the paper. He knew. He knew what he was doing was wrong, and he did it anyway. Grief does terrible things to people, Blackwood said quietly. It doesn't excuse him, but maybe it explains him. That night Sarah sat with Ranger in the quiet recovery room. Maggie had gone home, promising to return in the morning. Ranger was asleep, his breathing steady, his wounds finally beginning to heal. I read Mark's letter, Sarah whispered. And I understand something now. He hurt you because he was hurt. He projected his pain onto you because he couldn't carry it alone. She paused, tears sliding down her cheeks. But that's not love. Love doesn't demand you become something you're not. Love doesn't punish you for being gentle in a world that wants you hard. Ranger stirred slightly but didn't wake. Maggie lost her husband to PTSD. She understands what it's like to love someone who's broken, but she also understands that healing isn't about becoming who you were before. It's about accepting who you are now. Sarah reached out, her hand hovering over Ranger's paw. And who you are, gentle, sensitive, kind, that's not weakness. That's your strength. Mark couldn't see it. George couldn't see it. But Maggie does, and so do I. She let her hand rest gently on his paw. This time, Ranger didn't flinch. In his sleep, his paw shifted slightly, pressing back against her palm. It was the smallest gesture. But it was everything. The next morning, Morrison cleared Ranger for discharge. He's stable enough for home care, but Sarah, he still isn't eating adequately. If he doesn't start eating more in the next week, we'll need to consider a feeding tube. Sarah nodded, then went to call Maggie. He's ready. If you still want, I'm on my way. Maggie arrived within the hour, carrying a small bag of supplies. She'd brought soft blankets, a water bowl, and something else, a faded blue bandana that had belonged to George. "It was George's favorite," she explained. "He wore it every day. I thought maybe it would help. Maybe Ranger would remember that George wasn't all bad, that there were good days too." They helped Ranger into Maggie's old pickup truck, moving slowly, carefully. He didn't resist, but he didn't help either. He simply allowed himself to be moved, passive and resigned. Sarah watched them drive away, Ranger in the passenger seat, Maggie's hand resting on his back. And for the first time since finding him in that frozen barn, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this broken dog and this lonely woman would find in each other what they'd both been missing, a reason to keep going, a reason to heal, a reason to believe that love, real love, was still possible, even after everything had been taken away. Maggie's house sat at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by snow-covered fields that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. It was a small ranch-style home, weathered by Montana winters, with a sagging front porch and windows that rattled in the wind. The paint had long since faded from white to a tired gray, and icicles hung from the eaves like frozen tears. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. Worn furniture that had seen decades of use, photographs on the mantel, Maggie and George on their wedding day, George in uniform, George with various dogs from his training days. The heating system groaned and wheezed, struggling to push warmth through the old pipes. Maggie had prepared a corner of the living room for Ranger. She'd laid down every blanket she owned, creating a soft nest near the fireplace. A space heater hummed nearby. She'd bought it the day before, spending money she didn't have because she couldn't bear the thought of Ranger being cold. Getting Ranger from the truck into the house took 20 minutes. He wouldn't walk. His legs seemed to have forgotten their purpose, and when Maggie tried to encourage him, he simply stood there, trembling. Finally, she half-carried, half-dragged him inside, her 75-year-old body protesting every step. "There now," she murmured, settling him onto the blankets. "This is home. Your home, for as long as you need it." Ranger lay exactly where she placed him, his eyes open but unfocused. Maggie sat beside him, catching her breath, feeling every one of her years in her aching joints. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional pop from the fireplace. "I know this isn't much," Maggie said softly. "The house is old like me. Everything creaks and groans, but it's safe here. Nobody will hurt you here. That I can promise." Ranger's eyes moved toward her voice but showed no recognition, no understanding. Just that same emptiness that had haunted him since Sarah found him in the barn. The first night was the hardest. Every 3 hours, Maggie's alarm would sound, and she'd wake to administer Ranger's medications, antibiotics, pain relievers, anti-inflammatories. Each pill had to be hidden in a small piece of cheese, the only food Ranger would occasionally accept. By dawn, Maggie was exhausted, her body crying out for uninterrupted sleep it wouldn't get. At 6 a.m., Sarah arrived with supplies. She found Maggie asleep in the chair beside Ranger, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, her hand resting on his back even in sleep. "Maggie," Sarah touched her shoulder gently. The old woman startled awake, momentarily confused. "Is it time for his medication? I'm sorry, I must have dozed." "You gave him his last dose 2 hours ago. I checked the log." Sarah helped Maggie stand, noting how the woman winced. "You need to take care of yourself too." "I'm fine." "You're exhausted. When was the last time you ate?" Maggie couldn't remember. Sarah sighed and went to the kitchen, finding it nearly empty. A few cans of soup, some crackers, a loaf of bread that was starting to mold. In the refrigerator, a carton of milk and a single egg. That was all. Sarah returned to the living room, her heart heavy. "Maggie, you can't care for Ranger if you collapse. I'm going to the store. I can't afford. I'm going to the store, Sarah repeated firmly. And when I come back, you're going to eat. And then you're going to rest. Those are the conditions for keeping Ranger here. You take care of yourself, or this doesn't work. Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Sarah returned an hour later with groceries, real food, not just soup and crackers. She made Maggie breakfast, then lunch, and insisted the woman eat every bite. While Maggie ate, Sarah sat with Ranger, checking his wounds, noting that they were healing well despite everything else. "He still hasn't eaten," Maggie said, her voice small. "I've tried everything. The prescription food Dr. Morrison sent, regular dog food, chicken. He just turns his head away." Sarah looked at Ranger, at his protruding ribs, his hollow eyes. Morrison's words echoed in her mind. "If he doesn't start eating, we'll need a feeding tube. Give him time. Sometimes trauma kills the appetite. The body forgets how to want things." "What if time isn't enough?" Maggie's voice broke. "What if I'm not enough?" Sarah met her eyes. "You're doing everything right. Sometimes that's all we can do." Over the next 3 days, a routine emerged. Sarah visited twice daily, bringing supplies and checking on both Ranger and Maggie. Volunteers from the shelter took turns stopping by, offering support. Dr. Morrison made house calls, adjusting medications, monitoring Ranger's slow physical recovery, but Ranger remained locked away. He tolerated the medical procedures with blank acceptance. He took his medications because Maggie was patient enough to coax him. But he didn't engage, didn't respond, didn't seem to care whether he lived or died. On the 4th night, Maggie hit her breaking point. She'd been reading to Ranger, as she did every evening, when the weight of it all crashed down on her. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the fear that she wasn't helping at all. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, setting down her book. "George, if you can hear me, I don't know what to do. I'm trying to fix what you started, but I don't know how." She looked at the photograph on the mantel, George in his uniform, young and strong before the war destroyed him. "You were a good man once. You loved dogs, loved their loyalty, their courage. But the war twisted that love into something cruel. You made them hard because you'd been made hard. And this one," she gestured to Ranger, "this one you rejected because he wouldn't break the way you'd been broken." Maggie wiped her eyes. "I'm angry at you, George. I'm so angry. But I'm also sorry. Sorry I couldn't save you. Sorry I couldn't make you see that gentleness wasn't weakness. Maybe if I had, you'd still be here. And this dog wouldn't be dying inside because he reminds men like you of their failures." A sound made her turn. Ranger had lifted his head, just slightly, and was looking at her, really looking at her. His eyes weren't empty anymore. They were full of something raw and painful. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of shared grief. "You miss him too, don't you?" Maggie said softly. "George, even though he hurt you, even though he rejected you, some part of you remembers when he was kind. When he was the man who first held you as a puppy and promised you'd be something special." Ranger's eyes held hers. For the first time since arriving, he seemed present, aware. Maggie reached out slowly and picked up George's blue bandana. She held it out to Ranger. "He wore this every day. It smells like him. Tobacco and Old Spice and the outdoors. I thought it might help you remember. But maybe—" Her voice caught. "Maybe remembering is what's keeping you trapped." She set the bandana beside Ranger. "You don't have to forgive him. God knows I haven't fully forgiven him for leaving me. But maybe we can remember the good parts without letting the bad parts destroy us." Ranger looked at the bandana. Then, slowly, so slowly Maggie almost didn't believe it was happening, he moved his head forward and pressed his nose against the fabric. He inhaled deeply, and a sound emerged from his throat. Not quite a whimper, not quite a sigh. Something in between. Something that sounded like grief finally being released. And then Ranger did something that made Maggie's heart stop. He shifted his body painfully, laboriously, until his head rested against her leg, not pulling away from her touch as he always had, choosing it, seeking it out. Maggie's hands trembled as she rested one on Ranger's head. "That's it," she whispered. "That's it, sweet boy. You don't have to carry this alone." They stayed like that for a long time, an old woman and a broken dog, both grieving the same man for different reasons, both trying to figure out how to live with what he'd left behind. The next morning, Sarah arrived to find something had shifted. She couldn't put her finger on it at first. Ranger was still thin, still damaged, still withdrawn, but there was something different in the way he looked at Maggie, a connection that hadn't been there before. "What happened?" Sarah asked. Maggie shook her head. "I don't know. Last night we talked about George, about pain, about forgiveness, and something changed. Not much, but something." Sarah knelt beside Ranger. "Hey, buddy, can you look at me?" Ranger's eyes shifted to her, and there, barely visible but undeniably present, was a spark, a flicker of the dog he might have been, the dog he still could be. "He's coming back," Sarah breathed. "Maggie, he's coming back." But even as hope bloomed, reality intruded. That evening, when Maggie tried to feed Ranger, he still refused. He watched her place the food bowl beside him, then turned his head away with that same resigned indifference. Maggie called Sarah, her voice thick with tears. "He still won't eat. He's getting weaker. I can see it. What if this connection we made isn't enough? What if he's too far gone?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She stood in her own kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, and felt the weight of her failure pressing down again. She'd found Ranger. She'd saved his life. She'd placed him with Maggie. But none of it mattered if he couldn't find a reason to want to live. "I'll call Dr. Morrison," Sarah finally said. "We'll figure something out." But that night, as Sarah lay awake in her own bed, she wondered if there was anything left to figure out. Sometimes the body could heal even when the spirit couldn't. Sometimes surviving wasn't the same as living. And sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, the damage ran too deep to ever truly mend. At Maggie's house, the old woman sat beside Ranger in the darkness, the only light coming from the dying fire. She stroked his head gently, feeling his ribs beneath her fingers, feeling him slip away despite her efforts to hold on. "Please," she whispered, "please don't give up. I know the world has been cruel. I know you've been given every reason to stop fighting. But please, I need you to hold on. Not for me, not for George, for yourself. You deserve to live, sweet boy. You deserve to know what it feels like to be loved without pain, to be safe without fear. Please, just hold on a little longer." Ranger's eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow, and Maggie wondered if her words were reaching him at all, or if she was just talking to the ghost of a dog who'd already decided his story was over. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the world in white, covering mistakes and memories and pain in a blanket of temporary peace. But morning would come. Morning always came. And with it, the question that haunted them all: would Ranger still be there to see it? Morning came with cruel clarity. Maggie woke in her chair, her neck stiff and aching, to find Ranger exactly as he'd been the night before, breathing, but barely present. His water bowl sat untouched. The food had congealed into an unappetizing mass. 7 days in her care, and he was wasting away despite her best efforts. She checked his vitals as Dr. Morrison had taught her. Pulse weak but steady, temperature slightly below normal, respiration shallow. She wrote the numbers in her log with shaking hands, then reached for her phone to call Sarah. Before she could dial, headlights swept across the front windows. Sarah appeared at the door with Dr. Morrison. Their faces told Maggie everything she needed to know. They'd been discussing Ranger, discussing options, discussing what to do when hope runs out. "How is he?" Morrison asked, though his eyes had already found Ranger and made their own assessment. "The same, maybe weaker." Maggie's voice was small. "I tried again last night with the food. He won't even look at it." Morrison knelt beside Ranger, conducting a thorough examination. His expression grew more grave with each passing moment. When he finally stood, he pulled Sarah aside, but Maggie could hear every word in the small house. "His body is shutting down. Another 48 hours without nutrition, and we'll have no choice but to intervene with a feeding tube. Even then—" Morrison paused. "Sarah, he's giving up. His body is following what his mind decided days ago. There has to be something. We've tried everything. Medical intervention can only do so much. The rest has to come from him. He has to want to live." Maggie stood on trembling legs. "Then we make him want to." Both turned to look at her. Sarah's expression was pained. "Maggie, we can't force—" "Not force. Remind." Maggie moved to the mantel and took down a photograph. George with a German Shepherd puppy, both of them young, both of them whole. This was Scout, before George broke him, before the world broke George. Look at his eyes in this picture. Look at the joy there. She brought the photo to Ranger and held it where he could see it. "You remember this, don't you? You remember when the world was kind, when hands meant safety, not pain, when your heart was full of nothing but love and trust." Ranger's eyes flickered to the photo. Something passed across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or pain at remembering what had been lost. "That dog is still in there," Maggie insisted, looking at Sarah and Morrison. "Buried under all the hurt. We just have to reach him." "How?" Sarah's voice broke. "Maggie, we've tried gentleness, patience, time. Then maybe it's time to stop being gentle." Maggie's voice strengthened. "Maybe it's time to get angry, to demand he fight." Before anyone could stop her, Maggie knelt beside Ranger, her arthritic knees protesting, and looked directly into his eyes. When she spoke, her voice was fierce, commanding, nothing like the soft, soothing tones she'd used before. "Listen to me. You don't get to quit. You don't get to let them win. George, Mark, all the men who hurt you, you don't give them that satisfaction." Her hands gripped his face, forcing him to maintain eye contact. "I know it hurts. God, I know. I watched George die by inches, watched the war and the guilt eat him alive. And when he pulled that trigger, part of me died too. Part of me wanted to follow him into that darkness." Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "But I didn't. I woke up every morning even though the bed was empty. I ate even though food tasted like ash. I kept breathing even though every breath hurt. You know why? Because giving up would mean they won. The war. The pain. The men who thought breaking things made them strong." Ranger's breathing quickened. His eyes were locked on hers now, really seeing her. "You're a survivor, Ranger. You survived George's rejection. You survived Mark's torture. You survived 6 months in hell. And you're going to survive this too, because that's what survivors do. We endure. We persist. We refuse to let the bastards win." "Maggie," Sarah started, but Morrison held up a hand, stopping her. "I'm not asking you to forgive them. Maggie continued, her voice raw. "I haven't forgiven George. Not fully. Maybe I never will, but I refuse to die with him. And you—" Her grip tightened slightly. "You refuse too. You hear me? You refuse." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Ranger did something he hadn't done since Sarah found him. His mouth opened and a sound emerged, rough, broken, but undeniably a bark. Not loud, not strong, but defiant, a declaration that he was still here, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. Maggie released him and sat back, shaking. There you are." Morrison moved quickly, checking Ranger again. His heart rate is elevated. "That's good. He's responding." But as quickly as the spark appeared, it faded. Ranger's head dropped back to the blankets, exhausted from even that small act of defiance. The food bowl still sat untouched. Sarah knelt beside Maggie. "That was incredible. But he still won't eat." Then we changed tactics. Maggie pushed herself up with visible effort. "Come with me." She led them to the kitchen and opened the freezer. Inside, carefully wrapped and labeled, were dozens of containers. After George died, I couldn't bear to cook for one, but I couldn't stop cooking either. It was the only thing that made me feel useful, so I made meals and froze them. For emergencies, for when someone needed help. She pulled out a container labeled George's beef stew, his favorite. "I made this the day before he died. He never got to eat it." Maggie's voice was steady now, purpose driving her forward. "It was his favorite. He'd make it for the dogs sometimes, when they were sick or scared. And he said it reminded them of being puppies, being cared for." She defrosted the container and began heating the stew on the stove. The rich aroma of beef, vegetables, and herbs filled the small kitchen. Sarah and Morrison watched in silence as Maggie worked, moving with the muscle memory of 40 years of cooking for a man who was no longer there. When the stew was warm, Maggie ladled a small portion into a bowl. She added a bit of Ranger's prescription food, mixing it together. Then she carried it back to the living room. "Scout," she said, using his old name. "Scout, do you remember this smell?" She held the bowl near his nose. Ranger's nostrils flared. His eyes opened wider. And for the first time in days, his head lifted. Just an inch, but it lifted. "That's George's stew, the one he made when you were scared during thunderstorms, when the fireworks on 4th of July terrified you, when the other trainers were too rough and you needed to remember that some humans were kind." Maggie's voice was soft again, coaxing. "He wasn't always cruel, was he? There were good days, too. Days when he was the man he was supposed to be." Ranger's nose moved closer to the bowl. Maggie held perfectly still, barely breathing. Behind her, Sarah gripped Morrison's arm. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, Ranger's tongue emerged. He licked at the stew, once, twice. His eyes closed as if the taste brought back memories too powerful to process while looking at the world. "That's it," Maggie whispered. "That's my boy." Ranger took another lick, then another. His movements were weak, uncertain, but he was eating. Actually eating. Maggie set the bowl down where he could reach it more easily. For the next 10 minutes they watched Ranger eat. He didn't finish the bowl. His shrunken stomach couldn't handle much, but he ate more than he had in over a week. When he finally stopped, he looked up at Maggie with something new in his eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of trust, the first fragile thread of hope. Morrison's voice was thick. "I've been a veterinarian for 25 years. I've never seen anything like that." "It wasn't the food," Sarah said quietly. "It was the memory, the connection to something before the pain." Maggie nodded, stroking Ranger's head. "Sometimes we need to remember that the people who hurt us weren't always monsters. They were broken people who broke others. George gave Scout this stew as an act of love. And somewhere deep inside, Scout remembered that love existed, that it was possible. But will he keep eating? Morrison asked the question they were all thinking. I don't know, Maggie admitted. But today he ate. Today he chose to live. And tomorrow, we'll face tomorrow. Over the next 3 days, Maggie prepared George's stew for every meal. Each time, Ranger ate a little more. Not enough, not yet, but progress. Measurable, undeniable progress. His wounds continued to heal. His eyes grew clearer. He was still withdrawn, still fearful, but the death that had clung to him like a shadow began to recede. On the 10th day, something shifted again. Sarah arrived for her morning visit to find Maggie on the phone, her face pale. What's wrong? Maggie ended the call, her hand trembling. That was the prosecutor's office. Mark Collins' lawyer has filed a motion. He wants Ranger returned. The room tilted. He can't. The restraining order. The lawyer claims Ranger is personal property, illegally seized. They're arguing that Mark's mental health issues mean he wasn't competent to understand the restraining order. There's a hearing in 3 days. Sarah felt ice flood her veins. They can't give Ranger back to him. It would kill him. Everything we've done, I know. Maggie looked at Ranger, who was watching them both with worried eyes as if sensing the distress in their voices. I know. Morrison arrived within the hour, summoned by Sarah's frantic call. This is a legal nightmare. Technically, until Mark is convicted of animal cruelty, Ranger is still considered his property under Montana law. That's insane, Sarah snapped. You've documented the abuse. We have photographs, medical records, and Mark's lawyer will argue it was the result of untreated PTSD, that Mark wasn't in his right mind, that he deserves the chance to reclaim his property now that he's receiving treatment. Morrison's face was grim. I've seen cases like this before. The law protects property rights more than animal welfare. If the judge is sympathetic to a veteran with mental health issues, we won't let them take him. Maggie's voice was steel. I don't care what the law says. They're not taking him. Maggie, if you interfere with a court order, then I interfere. I'm 75 years old. What are they going to do? Send me to prison? I've already lost my husband. I've already lost everything that mattered. I'm not losing this dog too. Sarah looked between them, her mind racing. There might be another way. What if Ranger isn't here? What if before the hearing, he's somewhere Mark and his lawyers can't reach? Morrison's eyes widened. Sarah, you're talking about... I'm talking about protecting an innocent life from being returned to his abuser. I'm talking about doing what's right, even if it's not legal. You could lose your license to operate the shelter. You could face charges. I could live with that, Sarah said quietly. What I can't live with is watching Ranger go back to hell because the law values property over life. Maggie stood, resolution hardening her features. When do we move him? Tonight, Sarah decided. Before they can serve any papers, before they can enforce anything. I know a place, a volunteer's cabin in the mountains, isolated, safe. Ranger can recover there, and by the time anyone finds him, maybe we'll have built enough of a case to... A sound stopped them all. They turned to find Ranger standing, actually standing on his own for the first time in days. He was looking at the front door, his body tense, his ears alert. And then they heard it too. A car engine, tires on gravel. Sarah moved to the window and felt her heart stop. A sheriff's vehicle. And beside it a sedan she recognized. Mark Collins' lawyer. They're here, she whispered. They're already here. Maggie moved to stand between Ranger and the door. They're not taking him. I don't care who they are. They're not taking him. Morrison's face was pale. Maggie, if you resist, then I resist. The knock came, sharp and official. Sheriff Blackwood's voice followed. Mrs. Walsh, I need you to open the door. I have a court order for the immediate return of the dog known as Ranger to Mark Collins, pending the criminal hearing. Maggie didn't move. Behind her, Ranger began to tremble, understanding on some primal level that danger stood on the other side of that door. Mrs. Walsh, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Maggie looked at Sarah, at Morrison, at Ranger. In her eyes was a decision made, a line drawn. No, she called out. No, you can't have him. The silence that followed Maggie's refusal was deafening. Through the door, they could hear low voices conferring, Blackwood and the lawyer debating their next move. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in disaster. If Maggie resisted, she could be arrested. If they forced entry, Ranger would be traumatized all over again. And if Mark got him back... The knock came again, but this time it was gentler. Mrs. Walsh, it's Tom Blackwood. Can we talk? Just you and me? Maggie glanced at Sarah, who nodded. Maggie opened the door just wide enough to step outside, closing it behind her to keep Ranger from view. Through the window, Sarah watched the sheriff, a man in his 50s with gray temples and tired eyes, speak quietly to Maggie. The lawyer, a sharp-suited man from Billings, stood beside his sedan, checking his phone with obvious impatience. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she saw Maggie shake her head firmly, saw Blackwood's shoulders slump, saw him gesture back toward his vehicle, clearly torn between duty and conscience. When Maggie finally came back inside, her face was ashen. The court order is legitimate. Mark's lawyer convinced a judge that as the legal owner, Mark has the right to reclaim his property during the criminal proceedings. If we don't hand Ranger over, the sheriff has authorization to enter and remove him by force, and I'll be charged with obstruction. How long do we have? Morrison asked. Minutes. Tom gave me a few minutes to say goodbye. Ranger had retreated to his corner, his body pressed against the wall, shaking violently. He knew, somehow he knew what was coming. His eyes found Maggie's, and in them was a plea so desperate it broke her heart. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Stall them. Help is coming. E.H. E.H.? Sarah's mind scrambled, then landed on it. Emily Hartford, the young woman who'd applied to foster Ranger weeks ago. The application Sarah had approved but never finalized because Ranger had ended up with Mark instead. But how did Emily know what was happening? Another knock, more insistent this time. Mrs. Walsh, I'm sorry, but we need to proceed. Maggie knelt beside Ranger, her arthritic knees screaming in protest, and wrapped her arms around him. I'm so sorry. I promised I'd keep you safe, and I'm breaking that promise. But you listen to me. You survived before, and you'll survive again. Don't give up. Don't you dare give up. Ranger pressed against her, a low whine emerging from his damaged throat, the sound of a soul being torn apart. The door opened without permission. Sheriff Blackwood entered, his face a mask of professional regret. Behind him, the lawyer, all cold efficiency. Mrs. Walsh, please step aside. We need to take the animal. His name is Ranger, Maggie said fiercely. Not the animal. Ranger, he's not property. He's a living being who's suffered enough. Legally, ma'am, he is property, and the court has ruled the court is wrong. Blackwood's expression softened. I know. God help me, I know. But I'm sworn to uphold the law, even when the law is cruel. He moved toward Ranger, leash in hand. Ranger scrambled backward, his healing wounds reopening with the sudden movement. Blood began seeping through his bandages. His eyes were wild with terror, his breathing rapid and shallow. Stop! Morrison stepped forward. You're causing medical distress. As his veterinarian, I can't allow— Dr. Morrison, please don't make me arrest you too. Sarah's phone buzzed again. 2 minutes. Keep them talking. Sarah moved between Blackwood and Ranger. Sheriff, think about what you're doing. That dog has been tortured. He's barely started to heal. Sending him back to his abuser, Mark Collins isn't receiving him personally. The dog goes to a court-approved facility until the hearing. What facility? Show me the paperwork. Blackwood hesitated, and in that hesitation, Sarah saw the truth. There was no facility. This was a ruse. Mark's lawyer had convinced a judge to return Ranger directly to Mark's custody, mental health treatment or not. The lawyer checked his watch. Sheriff, we're wasting time. Remove the animal. Blackwood reached for Ranger, and several things happened at once. Ranger, cornered and terrified, did what any traumatized animal would do. He snapped, not a bite, but a warning. His teeth bared, a guttural sound emerging from his throat. It was the first time he'd shown any aggression, and it came from pure survival instinct. The dog is dangerous, the lawyer said immediately, pulling out his phone to record. Sheriff, this animal is displaying aggressive behavior. That changes everything. He's scared, Maggie cried. He's not dangerous. He's terrified. But the damage was done. The lawyer had his video evidence. Ranger's defensive display would be twisted into proof of dangerous behavior, another weapon in Mark's legal arsenal. And then, cutting through the chaos, came the sound of another vehicle, then another. Car doors slamming. Voices. Sarah looked out the window and felt hope surge through her. A news van from the Billings television station. Behind it, 3 more cars. Volunteers from the shelter, alerted somehow to converge here. And at the front of the group, a woman Sarah recognized from the foster application photo. Emily Hartford, 32 years old, a school teacher with kind eyes and determined expression. Emily pushed through the front door, followed by a man in a suit. Sheriff Blackwood, I'm Emily Hartford, and this is my attorney, David Chen. We're filing an emergency motion to block this order. The lawyer from Billings bristled. On what grounds? You have no standing, on the grounds that I'm the rightful foster parent. My approved application predates Mark Collins's by 6 weeks. Due to an administrative error at Second Chance Shelter, my application was never finalized, and Ranger was incorrectly placed with Mr. Collins. Sarah's mouth fell open. It was true. Emily's application had been approved first. But in the chaos of the shelter's busy season, Sarah had never completed the placement. She'd moved on to what seemed like a better option, an experienced K-9 handler. That decision had nearly cost Ranger his life. That's absurd, Billings' lawyer sputtered. The dog has been with Mr. Collins for 6 months. Possession obtained through fraudulent means, Chen interrupted smoothly, pulling out documents. My client's application was legally approved on March 15th. Mr. Collins' application wasn't even submitted until April 28th. Montana law clearly states that in cases of competing claims, the first approved application takes precedence. This is ridiculous. We have a court order, which we're challenging as based on incomplete information. Judge Morrison, Chen emphasized the name, wasn't informed of Ms. Hartford's prior claim. That's grounds for immediate stay of execution. The news camera was rolling now, capturing everything. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, stepped forward with her microphone. Sheriff Blackwood, is it true that you're attempting to return an abused animal to his abuser? Blackwood's face reddened. That's not— The situation is more complex. Is the dog visibly injured? Yes, but— And you're removing him from medical care to return him to the man who caused those injuries? The court ordered— A court order, you're now aware, may have been obtained under false pretenses. The reporter turned to her camera. This is Amanda Chen reporting from what may be a shocking case of legal manipulation in animal abuse proceedings. Billings' lawyer grabbed Blackwood's arm. We need to leave, now, before this becomes a media circus. But it already was. More cars were arriving. Volunteers had clearly spread the word. Within minutes, a dozen people stood in Maggie's small front yard, some holding signs hastily made from cardboard. Justice for Ranger. Abuse is not ownership. Protect the innocent. Emily knelt beside Ranger, moving slowly, carefully. Hey, buddy. My name is Emily. I was supposed to be your home 6 months ago, and I'm so sorry I wasn't. I'm so sorry you went through hell because of paperwork, because of human failure, but I'm here now, and I'm not leaving until you're safe. Ranger looked at her with those intelligent, wounded eyes. He didn't approach her, didn't trust her, not yet. But he didn't retreat either. Chen was on his phone, speaking rapidly. After a moment, he looked up. Judge Morrison will hear our emergency motion in 1 hour. Until then, the existing order is stayed. Ranger stays here. You can't, Billings' lawyer began. I just spoke with the judge's clerk. The stay is official. If you attempt to remove the dog now, you'll be in contempt. Chen's smile was sharp. I suggest you leave before my client files a harassment complaint. Sheriff Blackwood looked relieved. He'd been given an out, a way to leave without forcing the issue. I'll wait for the judge's decision. Mrs. Walsh, the dog remains in your custody until further notice. As Blackwood and the lawyer retreated to their vehicles, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. But inside the small house, the mood was cautiously hopeful at best. Emily stood, approaching Sarah. I've been following Ranger's case since I saw it on the news. When I realized you were the Sarah Mitchell who never finalized my application, I knew I had to help. I called everyone I could think of, the media, volunteers, my attorney brother-in-law. She paused. I should have followed up months ago. If I had, none of this would have happened. We all failed him, Sarah said quietly. Every person who was supposed to protect him failed. Maggie, still on the floor beside Ranger, spoke without looking up. Then we stop failing. Right now. No more mistakes. No more broken promises. Morrison checked Ranger's wounds, which had reopened during the confrontation. Fresh blood stained the bandages. He needs immediate care. The stress has set back his physical healing. I'll take care of him, Maggie said. You can't do this alone anymore, Emily said gently. Let me help. Let us all help. Maggie, you've done so much, but you're exhausted. Your house is freezing. You're barely eating. How can you help him heal when you're falling apart? Tears rolled down Maggie's weathered cheeks. I'm all he has. No, Emily corrected. He has all of us. And we're not going anywhere. Sarah's phone rang. The prosecutor's office. She answered, listening, her expression growing increasingly grim. When she hung up, everyone was watching her. The prosecutor just got an interesting piece of information. Mark Collins' lawyer. He's being investigated for ethics violations. Apparently, this isn't the first time he's used questionable legal tactics to help clients reclaim animals post-abuse charges. There's a pattern. The Bar Association is involved. Which means, Morrison asked, which means the court order that brought them here today might be thrown out entirely. The judge is furious. He was apparently misled about the facts of the case. Hope, fragile and tentative, bloomed in the room. But it was Chen who voiced the question they all feared asking. And if the order is thrown out, what happens to Ranger then? Sarah looked at Maggie, at Emily, at the dog who'd suffered so much because the humans around him kept failing. Then we make sure this time we get it right. We make sure he goes somewhere safe, somewhere he can finally heal, somewhere he can learn that not all humans are monsters. Emily knelt beside Ranger again. I have a house, 3 bedrooms, big yard, quiet neighborhood. I'm a teacher, so I'm home by 4 every day, off all summer. I've been alone since my grandmother died, and the house feels too big for just me." She looked at Ranger. "I know I'm a stranger. I know you've been hurt by strangers, but I promise you, I will never hurt you, and I will never give up on you." Ranger's eyes met hers. He didn't move toward her, didn't move away. He simply looked at her, as if measuring the weight of her words against the weight of his pain. Maggie reached out, her hand finding Emily's. "He needs more than I can give him. I see that now. My house is falling apart. I can barely afford to feed myself, much less a dog with medical needs. I wanted to be enough, but wanting isn't the same as being able." "You are enough," Emily said firmly. "You saved his life. You gave him a reason to keep fighting. But now, let's give him more than survival. Let's give him a life worth living." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of gold and pink. The protesters remained, keeping vigil, their presence a shield against anyone who might try to harm Ranger again. And inside, in the small living room that had witnessed so much pain and so much stubborn hope, a decision crystallized. Not a perfect solution, not an easy one, but perhaps finally the right one. Sometimes the hardest truth we face is this: we thought we'd done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Sarah believed she'd found Ranger the perfect home, an experienced handler, a man who understood dogs. Maggie thought love and patience would be sufficient to heal wounds carved deep by cruelty. Emily wondered if her approved application 6 months earlier could have prevented all this suffering. Each of them carried the weight of good intentions that paved a road to hell. But here's what they learned, what perhaps we all must learn. Healing isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when you're exhausted. It's about admitting when you need help, when your best isn't enough alone. It's about building something bigger than yourself. A community, a safety net, a circle of people who refuse to let the broken fall through the cracks. Ranger didn't need perfection. He needed persistence. He needed people who wouldn't give up when the first solution failed or the second or the third. We all do. Because happiness isn't found in doing everything right the first time. It's found in refusing to stop trying until we finally get it right together. Have you ever felt like your best wasn't enough? What helped you keep going when everything seemed to fall apart? Share your story in the comments. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.